y'all? Welcome back to the next episode of the Old Style Angling Podcast. Ben and Brandon coming back at you. Today we're going to be talking about some underrated fishing opportunities here in Wisconsin and how to catch them, along with just a basic report of the fishing that we've had the last couple days and throughout the last week or so, and what we're seeing across the state. So to get started, I'm going to let Brandon chat with you for a little while about what he's seen throughout the last week. He's been out quite a bit in some different areas, targeting some different fish. So we'll let him explain what he's been seeing and what kind of patterns he's found throughout the last week.
Hey everybody, it's good to be back on the podcast. Today I'm just going to kind of talk a little bit about the musky conditions we've been facing, the bite, how this rain has impacted a few different types of fishing. Yesterday I went out trout fishing, so we'll cover that a little bit. I guess first off, things have been getting better as far as the musky bite is gone. I was able to score 2 fish Thursday night. I had a good feeling about it all day. I could tell we were going into a cold front. We had some off rain all day. And then moonset was at 6:47 p.m. And I tell you, as soon as I got down there, right around 5:30, there was fish activity instantly. I was seeing muskies chasing bait and a few other species jumping around. You could just tell, it was set up to be a good night. And I was able to get both of those fish right around noon, within 20 minutes. Moonset was at 6:47. First fish came at 6:23, and the second fish came about 3 minutes before moon. So I know there's some controversy on, if moon is a real thing, if it affects the fish that much. Personally for me, I think it plays a huge role. Most of the bigger fish I've seen, especially on the river, have come within, 20 minutes, half an hour of either moonrise or moonset. So that's always something to look for. Another thing I want to note is the activity that I was getting out of those fish, it was all on smaller baits. I was able to get both of those fish on smaller rubber baits, like 8 inches or so. They weren't really chasing, bigger rubber baits, nothing fast. It just seemed to be slow and small. That was working. As I was fishing today, I noticed the same thing. I was able to get a couple fish to follow on top water, had a low 40s, do a few turns in the 8 at my feet. But that was really the extent of the action today on bigger baits. But towards the evening, I ran into another fisherman, and he was actually fly fishing, and he had moved 6 fish today, all on like a 4 or 5 inch fly. So it's pretty safe to guess that a lot of these fish that are, pushed up tighter to the shore are looking for big schools of bait and eating mostly minnows. And it seems like the minnow presentation was definitely outfishing the panfish or walleye or whatever you want. So I thought that was pretty interesting. Definitely going to try downsizing the next couple of days, see if that makes a big difference. As far as yesterday goes, like I mentioned, I did go out trout fishing. I went over to the driftless area, just a ways north of Ben, and, it was raining all day. We took a gamble heading over there, hoping that the streams would be just muddy enough to, keep us out of visibility from the fish. But it turned out the streams were washed out. So that was a bummer. That was like 5-6 hours in the car, and we did not see a fish. But you never know unless you try. And, as the rain dies off and the streams start to go down, if we get this rain the next couple of days, give it probably, 4 or 5 days, depending on the stream, to kind of calm down from the rain. And once that water gets just a bit of a stained tint to it, but not completely chocolate milk, that's when you want to be out there. Those fish are going to be chomping hard. They're not going to be really eating too much in this dirty water. So as soon as it starts to clear up a little bit, we can expect good things.
All right, so yeah, that was pretty cool about the muskies hitting the small baits. I'm a true Wisconsin muskie angler, I guess you could say. I like going small for my muskies, and then going to the bigger baits instead of starting out big and going small. But that's just me, and I know that's kind of a Wisconsin thing to do in comparison to a a Minnesota muskie angler or a Ontario muskie angler. I know the Wisconsin guys generally use a smaller average size bait, I would say. Yeah, so for me, I haven't been out fishing a whole lot the last week. I've been pretty busy with work, but I did get out a couple nights, and we were starting to see some good panfish bites out in the Mississippi River. We were getting into some good perch bites in the evening, and so that's fun to see. Usually during from about mid-June to the end of July, the perch are real hard to target. They're kind of all over the place, and if you run into a school, you can really get into them. But they're hard to predict, hard to pattern that time of year. They can be deep, they can be super shallow. But now as we get into August, they start moving to their fall transition areas and areas where you can pattern the fish and get on bites a lot easier than midsummer. So that was an exciting thing to see for me, and I'm looking forward to some more good panfish bites in the coming weeks and into fall. Otherwise, today me and my girlfriend drove up to Eau Claire, and in between here and Eau Claire, all the streams and the rivers were just completely blown out. We had some real gully washers over the weekend on this side of the state, and I know the other side of the state as well got some rain. So the trout streams and the small rivers, the Black River was extremely high, the La Crosse River was extremely high, and all the streams were just super chocolate, real turbid, and so we weren't able to stop and do any trout fishing. Plus, we were getting hit by more storms, more rainstorms on the way back, so that was kind of a bummer, but we're looking forward to some good trout conditions in the coming weeks for sure. So the next thing I wanted to get into was underrated fish. I know in our Q&A that was one of the questions we got, and I know this is probably something more for river fishermen, but this can happen in lakes as well. I know in rivers a lot of times you can have a surprise fish on almost any cast you take. You can catch such a variety of species that it's just you never know what you're going to catch every time you go out. In lakes, sometimes you have a smaller window of diversity to pick from fish wise, so you might not run into gar or sheephead or other quote unquote trash fish or rough fish. So we're going to go over a couple of these species that are really actually not that hard to target and put up a real good fight and are just as rewarding to catch maybe for some as a big trophy walleye for a big walleye angler. A lot of people, if you're just going out to catch fish, this is a great way to get people into fishing because like I said, these are not overly difficult fish to target, and they put up a good fight. So the first species I want to go over is gar, and more specifically long-nosed gar. Now this is a fish that isn't found throughout the entire state, but in areas like the Mississippi River, they're widely abundant, and there's some days that it seems like you can't get away from them. If you're pan fishing with a minnow and you just constantly keep getting bit off by gar, you're in a good spot for gar. And the way that I actually target gar is on the fly. And what I use is like a piece of paracord, and I tie my own because it's a very simple fly and it doesn't take much fly tying skill, so even I can do it. So what I do is I take maybe a 3-inch, 4-inch piece of paracord, and I unravel the paracord so it's real stringy and unraveled, and I'll tie that onto like a worm hook for bass, so that hook with the bent shank, and I'll add just a little bit of weight, like I'll maybe crush a split shot on there or something, for a little weight so it drops down in the water. And so that's called a gar fly. And the hook is actually essentially irrelevant. You don't need the hook at all. The gar actually get their teeth caught in the line from the paracord, and really generally aren't hooked at all, because I mean, if you're familiar with a gar at all, you can see that they have a very long bony mouth that is almost impossible to get a hook into unless you're real lucky. And I've hooked a couple over the years, but it's, if you're going after them, you're going to get real frustrated after a while, after, trying to hook them and not succeeding. So using this gar fly tactic is a really easy way to target them, because they will almost hit anything if it flashes past them. If you put this fly in front of their face, they're going to be going after it. So I've got on some really good gar bites, actually, because like I said, once you find one gar, there's going to be more around. And obviously when you're using a fly rod, almost anything fights good on a fly rod. And catching, some of these gar get real big. So catching, I would say an average size gar is maybe 30 inches, including the mouth, the rostrum. So, I mean, that fish puts up a good fight on my 5-weight fly rod. So that's like I said, an easy fish to target. The hardest part about targeting gar is getting into a spot where the gar are without spooking them, because if they're spooked, obviously they're going to take off and the whole school's going to leave, and then you're going to have to find an entirely new spot to target these fish. So creeping into a spot is the big key to catching the gar, and kind of predicting where they're going to be. If you fished a spot before and you saw a bunch of gar, go back to that spot and start chucking the fly around looking for the gar, because that's where they're going to be. So the next species I want to cover is a species dear to my heart, close to my heart, the humble dogfish, the bowfin. You heard me talk about it before. It's probably my favorite fish out there, and I'll tell you, they're a big fish, and they put up a good fight, and you can target them a variety of ways. I mean, if you're familiar with bowfin or dogfish, you know that they'll hit almost any bait that you throw for bass or for northern pike, and you might get kind of frustrated with that fact. You do end up catching a lot of the smaller to mid-sized fish if you're using, say, a frog, a topwater frog, or a spinnerbait, or something of that nature. The way that I target them is using small bluegills under a bobber. And you don't want to. When I started trying to do this, I was using a big muskie bobber, like you would if you were throwing suckers for muskies. But that seems to me to be a little bit too heavy, and the fish can feel that when they're pulling the sunfish. So I wasn't getting good hookups, and I wasn't getting good committals from the dogfish. So I switched to a smaller bobber, and yeah, the sunfish can move it around a little bit more. But when that thing gets hit by a dog, you know about it. It's not gonna, there's no question that it's not the bait fish moving the bobber. So like I said, using small bluegills under a bobber is the way to go for me. And I'll chuck these in maybe a foot of water, because these dogfish, especially in the warmer times of the year, seem to inhabit these areas that are inaccessible to bass or northern because of low oxygen levels or high oxygen levels or whatever it may be. So that's the areas where I target them, and I'll throw it into thick scum, anything like that. They'll be in there, and like I said, this is a way to get the bigger fish, the fish that are closer to 6 to 10 pounds, and like I said, they're big fish and they put up a good fight. So that's another overlooked species that are not hard to catch, and they put up a good fight. And it's not every day that you can say, oh, I caught a 8-pound bowfin. That's a big fish. So that's another fun fish to target, and it's a fish that is actually a little bit more widespread throughout the state than people might think. The state record was actually caught, I believe, in Oneida County, and it's around 13 pounds. So they're down here on the Mississippi, they're in the Wisconsin River, and I know they're definitely over on the eastern side of the state as well. And then we're talking a lot about river fishing, but but there's rough fish in lakes, and there's overlooked fish in lakes as well. And one species that's kind of I'm pressed to say that it's an overlooked species, but it's a species that doesn't get the credit that it deserves, and that is the whitefish. Now, fishing on Lake Superior through the ice, Brandon and I have caught a lot of whitefish up on Lake Superior in the Chequamegon Bay area, and a lot of times we catch these when we can't get on a good brown trout bite, or we can't get on a good salmon bite, and we're just trying to catch something. We will start getting into the whitefish, and they're a lot easier to target than say a brown trout. And if you can get on them, you can get into a good school. It's a good time. So I'm going to let Brandon chat about this a little bit.
Yeah, so whitefish have saved us from many days of boredom up on Lake Superior. If the browns aren't biting, or we are struggling to get on a Laker bite, it's pretty easy to slide up a little bit shallower and find some of those whitefish. They might not be considered trophy fish, but they are pretty fun to catch, and they're a lot easier to catch. Your success rate is going to be a lot better if you're targeting those than, say, a 28, 30-inch brown, or, even a 20-pound Laker. You can get on some big big whitefish. We've ran into a couple in the upper 20s, and that one you caught, Patch, that might have even been pushing 30, huh?
I don't know if it was that big. I'd say it was maybe 24, 25 inches. It was a big one. And then I caught a brown trout right afterwards that was about the same exact size. So the brown fought a little bit harder, but it was fun to see that big whitefish.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I'll always remember that one time we went out, off of Madeline Island, and we were the only ones out there. We were getting all of these marks just chasing our baits nonstop. They'd chase it up really fast, 10, 15 feet. And eventually we said, screw it, let's, set up the shack and see if we can sight fish these. We were only in 20, 25 feet of water. So sure enough, we set up the shack, and we were right over a piece of timber in the sand. And we were looking down the hole, and there was a whole bunch of whitefish just darting around and chasing our baits. Yeah, so we were catching them on little slender spoons and little Castmasters. You can also, if you're really trying to finesse it, you can use little tungstens with waxies, the same way you would fish for, bluegills or any of the other panfish. If you're using light gear, it's a really good time. The only worry is if you're using that lighter gear, you may be screwed if a bigger fish comes along. I remember we were, catching these whitefish, and out of nowhere, this Laker came, and Ben hooked it. And on this light gear, it's very, very tough to control a lake trout. And it wasn't a monster, but it was a nice fish. And it just started screaming line, and that thing ended up below the ice about 50 yards away and popped off.
Yeah, that was kind of a embarrassing moment and a bummer for me. Yeah, those whitefish, I was fishing on just a little tungsten and a waxy, and here comes this Laker, and it just beelined it right. And like we said, we were sight fishing these fish, so we were able to see them. And this Laker came in and just smoked my jig, and I had, I would say, max 4-pound mono on that reel. And it stood no chance. And unfortunately, I fought it for a little while, and he got the better of me. But it's all right. There's always more fish out there, and it made for a good story. So, yeah, whitefish can be awesome fish to target. And I'd really love to get out on Lake Michigan over in Green Bay sometime and go after them. That's kind of a bucket list for me, is getting over there and fishing on the ice for whitefish and whatnot. So maybe this winter we'll get over there and do it. We'll just see what happens. But that's like I said, not, I won't say as overlooked, because they have made a huge comeback in the last couple of years, and there's starting to be guides that are taking people out for them, and like Brandon said, they saved us from some tough days out on Lake Superior. So don't overlook the whitefish, and try eating them as well. We've never tried it, and I kind of regret it because I've heard that they're very good, and that's something else that I'm gonna have to try in the future as well. All right, so we're gonna cover a couple more species here, but what I want to do first is just talk about fishing with a night crawler because if you're fishing on a river and you bottom rig a night crawler, that's a good way to catch anything. And you might be surprised after a while what you start catching because I know on the Mississippi River you can throw out a night crawler, and my girlfriend, she's an expert sheephead fisherman or freshwater drum or whatever you want to call them, and we've caught some big ones, especially this year. I don't understand why they've just been like we've been sheephead magnets over this summer, and it's been kind of frustrating, but when you're pan fishing or something with a worm and you run into a 10-pound sheephead, that thing puts up a fight. And I've actually caught them through the ice as well, which is kind of frustrating because here you're pulling up this huge fish and it's fighting, and you get it through the hole and you're thinking, oh, it's a trophy walleye, and here it ends up being maybe a 10-pound drum. That can kind of put a damper on your day, but that's one of those things that makes me wonder, what's the difference between catching a 10-pound sheephead and a 10-pound walleye? Obviously, there's a big difference, but it's just something I like to think about sometimes. That kind of philosophy of angling that runs through my mind when I'm sitting out on the boat not catching anything. So yeah, like I said, using a night crawler is a good way to catch anything, and from red horse to these fish that you don't generally target but are fun to see because you might be surprised at the diversity you have in your area or in your lake that you're fishing. And finally, the last species that we're going to cover in this bit, I would never disgrace the great name of this fish by calling it a trash fish, but it is, some people would call it a rough fish. It's one of our state's greatest treasures, the lake sturgeon. And disclaimer right off the bat, these fish are not legal to target in all areas. There is a catch and release season on the western side of the state, and there's also a catch and keep season that you can buy a tag for in some waters as well. And obviously there's a spearing season over on Lake Winnebago on the Winnebago system. But what I'm just going to talk about here is just targeting them for catch and release purposes only. And this is something that we do occasionally over here, and they're an interesting fish to target because obviously these are huge behemoths, some of the biggest fish that you'll ever see in this area. But the way you fish them is almost, it seems like a finesse approach because you don't want to use too big of a hook. I know the first time I targeted these fish, I ran into this problem. I was using too big of a hook and I was having no luck. And so downsizing the hook and downsizing the weight is it's kind of a balancing act that you have to find to catch these fish. And somebody that's actually had more success catching these fish is Brandon. So I'm going to let him talk a little bit about his approach for targeting lake sturgeon.
So, as Ben mentioned, the best way to get them is, usually a night crawler or cut bait on the bottom. And I know he mentioned, that balancing act between the right size weight, the right size hook. It definitely is, might be a bottom feeder, but they can be pretty finicky. A lot of times when they bite, it's very, very subtle. I've caught quite a few of them at night, and if you're not paying really close attention, you'll completely miss it. It's very, very deceiving. It's just a couple of quick bounces of the rod tip, and if you're not paying attention, you won't even notice it. It's, like I say, very deceiving because, it doesn't look like it's a big bite, and then you go to set the hook, and, you could have a 50-inch fish on.
Yeah, so that's a great point that Brandon brought up. Fishing at night, those taps on the rod can be real deceiving, like he said. sometimes they kind of mirror like if you were having a small walleye hit a big hook with a night crawler on it, because you'll run into that too, where you get these little tiny walleyes or little bullhead hitting the bait, and it's just like a little tap. So you never know when you set the hook whether you're going to be ripping the face off a tiny little walleye or if you're going to be setting into the biggest fish you'll ever catch in your life. So that's kind of another thing that adds a little excitement, because you never know. Like with some fish, you know when you're just getting a little nibble that it's, a small gill or it's a small walleye. But with the lake sturgeon, it's not that easy. So a real fun fish to target if you get the chance, and obviously make sure you're following the rules, because these fish are an extremely long-lived fish, an extremely fragile fish, and something that we need to take care of. So like I said, be careful targeting them, make sure you know where they are, and don't try not to fight them for a long period of time and tire them out, and make sure you know what you're doing before you're going out.
Okay, so this is kind of, unrelated to the sturgeon, but any of the other species that you might catch on worms, if that's not really your cup of tea, go out and use that as a learning experience. Go out on some of your local waters that you might not know that well. If you're, let's say, a muskie fisherman or a pike fisherman, or, even a walleye fisherman, understanding your ecosystem as a whole is going to help you find some of those larger fish. If you're catching, a lot of suckers in a spot and not another spot, that might be a good spot to target muskies in the fall. Follow that forage around. You might not be interested in catching suckers, but knowing where those suckers are could definitely benefit you in the long run.
Yeah, so that's a great addition that Brandon just brought up about fishing with a worm. I love fishing with a night crawler. I target walleyes a lot in the summer with night crawlers, and I run into a lot of channel catfish and other species that you might consider bycatch, but they always add some more excitement to your day, especially if you're having a tough day and you run into maybe a 10-pound channel cat on your ultralight gear. That really brings up your morale and can lead to some bigger fish later on that day. So obviously, fishing with a night crawler is something that we started out doing when we were kids, but is never something we should forget about. So that's going to wrap up our bit on talking about underrated, overlooked species that we have here in Wisconsin that can be really fun to target and could open up some new angling opportunities for people that might be getting a little burnout on some species here this year. This is a great way to introduce yourself to some new challenges and some new styles of fishing that you might not have thought about before. So share your catches with us on Instagram if you're going after these fish. We'd love to hear from you. And this is going to wrap up another episode of the Old Style Angling Podcast. Ben and Brandon are signing off. Thank you for listening, and tight lines, everybody.